Good afternoon. So glad that everyone could join us today for our webinar on skincare and sunscreen. My name is Marty Tedesco, and I am the Chief Marketing Officer for Peninsula Open Space Trust. And I wanted to welcome everybody today, our donors and our community members, old and new. Thanks for spending your lunch hour with us. I wanted to take a moment just to provide some context for those of you who are new as to who POST is and why we do webinars like this. So we are a 43-year-old nonprofit. We're a land trust that works predominantly in San Mateo and Santa Clara counties with a little bit of work in Santa Cruz County. And as you can see from this map in 1977, those green areas are protected lands in 1977. And if you fast forward to today in 2019 map, POST has worked to protect close to 80,000 acres on the peninsula and in the South Bay for the benefit of everyone who lives here, both people and nature. And, you know, it goes without saying that we have the great privilege to work in lands that have been settled for millennia by many indigenous people who came before us. And so we commonly refer to these lands as Ohlone lands throughout the scope and area where POST works. We have four main program areas. We work to protect redwoods, wildlife linkages, and farmland. And we also work to ensure that we have as much public access where and when possible on those lands. So today's topic really lends itself well to this notion of public access because, especially in these pandemic times, we're using our open spaces so much more for exercise, for respite, to get out of the house, to clear our heads. And what you see here on this map are 5 of our largest trails that run through our area. And you can see they're numbered, starting with the first trail, which is a trail that POST is working to develop from the bay to the sea, starting in Redwood City over to the coast. You can see the California Coastal Trail running down the western flank of both counties. The Long Ridge to Pomponio Trail, Trail C there, is an existing trail for a nice solid through hike. The Bay Area Ridge Trail, which goes around the ridge of the bay, probably our longest trail, and then the Coyote Creek Trail in the South Bay. So in between all of those trails, there's hundreds and hundreds of miles of trails. And as we're out there using those trails with our family and friends, we thought it would be important to talk about how to do so safely, not just from a COVID perspective, but how to protect yourself from the elements as well. So we invited a good friend of ours, Dr. Susan Swetter, to join us. There's Susan. I need to put my glasses on for this part because there's a lot of very complicated non-land trust words in Susan's bona fides here. She is a professor of dermatology and the assistant chief of dermatology service at the Veterans Administration in Palo Alto. She is the director of the Pigmented Lesion and Melanoma Program and the physician leader of the Cancer Care Program in Cutaneous Oncology at Stanford University Medical Center and Cancer Institute. Now, fun fact, Susan is a neighbor of mine. I happen to know she's a great athlete. She spends a lot of time outdoors. She is a hiker, a biker, a mom, a friend, a wife, and overall just a very knowledgeable and practical voice to have in times like these. So welcome, Susan.
Marty, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today.
That's so great. It's kind of funny because we live in the same neighborhood and I'm on the bottom of the hill, and so she's up at the top. So I feel like I should wave up to you. Tell us a little bit about where you've been hiking lately and where have you been outside most recently?
Well, we're lucky to live in Ladera, so there's a lot of hikes in our immediate neighborhood, moving into Westridge and then Corte Madera area. I was up at last weekend, which was just beautiful. Nice shady hike there amidst the cyclists and other hikers. But basically anywhere near and around the Bay Area and the San Mateo coast are some of our favorite hiking spots.
That's awesome. Yeah, me too. So one of the things I've noticed is more people out on the trails, and we have really, with the exception of the massive windstorm the other night, some exceptional weather right now. Just really beautiful, very sunny. We'd love to hear from you. I know you've given this talk many times before. We'd love to hear from you a little bit more. So take us through what kind of the flow of what you'll talk about today.
Sure. So I'm going to spend some time talking about outdoor skincare, but I'll focus on sun protection with sunscreens and such. I will also talk about plant dermatitis, but again, focusing on the exposures we tend to encounter in the wild, so poison oak here in California. And then I want to talk a little bit about insect repellents for mosquitoes and ticks, which are very relevant. So
that all sounds good. Take it away.
All right. Thanks so much. I will let Katie share my screen. Okay, well, thanks everybody. This talk will be on Facebook, so the slides, some of them are very text heavy, and I won't say anything on everything on the slides, so just feel free to listen and enjoy. I will be mentioning certain products and websites where sunscreens and insect repellents can be easily purchased, but I don't have any conflicts of interest with various companies. So as we move forward, I'm going to again start with about issues related to the sun. And most of the sun's radiation that reaches the Earth's surface is actually visible in infrared light, with UV light making up a pretty small percentage, only about 6% of the ultraviolet or UV light. Most of that is UVA light, which is a longer wavelength and is not blocked by the ozone layer. UVB light is also quite relevant, about 5% of the sun's radiation reaching our Earth's surface, and it tends to cause most of the skin cancers we see. UVC light you've probably heard about more recently. It's an antimicrobial wavelength, again blocked by ozone, but it was getting a lot of attention when the COVID pandemic started, as UVC wands were being advertised to fight any microbes on surfaces. So what does ultraviolet light do to the skin? And I promise this is probably the most graphic slide I'm going to show, but these are skin cancers, and we worry a lot about skin cancer in the field of dermatology. I'm, again, a melanoma specialist, and this is, again, near and dear to me to try to prevent these skin cancers, and aggressive sun protection can actually do that. So these are squamous cell skin cancer on the upper left on the lip, basal cell skin cancer on the cheek on the upper right, and that's the most common human cancer we see worldwide. And then below that, we see 3 types of melanomas. Now, sun damage over time is also kind of characterized by what we call photoaging, and that's what the longer wavelength UVA light tends to do. So here you see a baby's nice skin that's not sun damaged next to an older person who has wrinkling and sagging of the skin, and then these blood vessels that are more prominent because the sun accelerates the aging process where we lose subcutaneous fat in the skin. So the skin becomes more susceptible to trauma, bruising. You get age spots, which are not liver spots and have nothing to do with that, but they're related to the sun, and they're called lentigines, so brown spots, precancers, and skin cancers. So again, ultraviolet B, I alluded to, is the most important wavelength we see that causes sunburn and skin cancer. And it also is the wavelengths of light that are responsible for our tanning response. It is important to understand that it has variation during the day. It's stronger in the midday and is also much more intense in the summer than in the winter. And for skiers and hikers, it actually increases in terms of intensity by about 8 to 10% for every 1,000 feet of elevation. So you need to be very careful with using protective clothing, hats, eyewear, and sunscreen at higher elevations. UVA or ultraviolet A is a longer wavelength, so it penetrates more deeply into the skin. It doesn't have the seasonal or daily variation that we see with UVB. It's strong all year long. In addition to photoaging, though, because it's that longer, deeper penetration, it can cause cataracts. And when people are on certain medications that make them sensitive to the sun, it tends to be UVA that drives that, or certain conditions like lupus, where people get a sun-sensitive reaction. So we also know that UVA contributes to skin cancer, and that's largely from the data from tanning beds, which emit mostly UVA rather than UVB. Skin cancer, there'll be 1 in 5 Americans who develop skin cancer over their lifetime in the United States. Millions of basal cell carcinomas and squamous cell carcinomas. Those are what we call non-melanoma skin cancers. Most of those can be cured with surgical procedures and other modalities. And then melanoma we pay a lot of attention to, again, because it tends to be the most fatal skin cancer. And we'll see about 100,000 cases of invasive melanoma, about 10,000 alone in California this year, with 600 deaths. So we want to try to prevent this disease and or detect it early. It's well established that sun protective behaviors can prevent a significant proportion of both the non-melanoma and melanoma skin cancers. And that also includes avoidance of indoor tanning, again, which emits both UVA and UVB. So this is just a few pictures I wanted to show, and it seems intuitive, but somebody actually did the study. These are colleagues of mine from New York University, and they took a look at leisure habits and clothing that people were wearing from the last century and how that really correlated with spikes that we saw in particularly melanoma incidence from 1950 to 2000. And you can actually see, it's pretty obvious here, but they looked at leisure time activities, magazines, and then of course, photographs of what people were wearing and then where they were. But clothing basically out in the sun became skimpier over time for both men and women. And that's Sean Connery there on the right, bottom right. But it's just an interesting element to see how sun protection practices waned as clothing became less commonly used in all body sites over time. The other thing that we actually have seen more recently is understanding that people become almost addicted to tanning. And the UV tanning pathways will produce kind of this endorphin and opiate-like response. And so people tend to be more sun-seeking, and that includes with indoor tanning. And combating those behaviors is actually compounded by that fact. Tanning beds, as I said, emit mostly UVA, but also UVB, and this is in much stronger concentrations or intensity than we see with natural sunlight. They significantly increase the risk of those basal cells and squamous cells as well as melanoma. And in fact, it's estimated that every time a person is in a tanning booth, it increases their melanoma risk almost 2%, and that more people develop skin cancer from indoor tanning than they do lung cancer because of smoking. So these are really bad news. They've been prevalent since the 1980s. At a time when I was in college and people used to be marketed, get a baseline tan, you won't get sunburned, and none of that's really panned out. And also the issue of tanning bed lobbies telling people that they need to use tanning beds to get their vitamin D, which is a fallacy. Now, since 2011, California was the first state in the nation to ban tanning beds for minors, and this is really important. There are now an additional 20 states along with DC that have also passed this under 18 tanning legislation. There's a lot of room to go. We have countries like Australia, Brazil, Iran who've actually blocked tanning beds entirely. They've removed them. We need to move toward that in the United States, and I hope we'll be successful. But even with the bans we've seen in these 21 states and DC since 2011, we've actually seen now a reduction in high school students who partake in indoor tanning by over 50%. So this is good news and something we need to continue to work on from a legislative standpoint. So who gets skin cancer? Well, people who have lighter skin tones or lighter skin complexion are more at risk for getting skin cancer. And your skin cancer, your skin type or phenotype or phototype actually is dependent on the amount of pigment or melanin that your pigment cells, which are called melanocytes, have. So everybody, regardless of their skin complexion or skin tone, has the same number of pigment cells. It's just the degree and quality of the melanin, the actual pigment in them. So the more melanin your skin has, the darker your natural skin color is, and the more protected you are from harmful UV light. When we take a look at these skin types in dermatology, we'll call them Fitzpatrick skin phototypes. They range from 1 to 6. With type 1 skin being the red hair phenotype, very dangerous phenotype for skin cancer. Most Caucasians, again, having types 1, 2, and 3. Darker skin individuals, darker racial ethnic groups having types 4, 5, and 6. And it's important to understand that the sun will cause DNA damage to all skin types, but less so in darker skin phenotypes. So this is a young girl with skin type 1, and it's actually been shown in mice models very scarily that even having, without sun exposure, the red hair gene tends to increase the risk for skin cancer. So we really have to promote aggressive sun protection practices in individuals with type 1 skin. What's become known, though, more over the last few decades is really that the darker complexion individuals, skin phototypes 4, 5, and 6, are still at risk for skin cancer. And for an example, in California, where about 40% of our population identifies as Hispanics, we've actually seen melanoma increase to almost 2% per year in men and about 0.6% per year in women since 1988. And that's relevant. We understand from other studies that have been done that Hispanic children tend to burn at the same rates as non-Hispanic white children. We see less sun protection practices, less melanoma awareness among darker complexioned individuals, and individuals are less likely to look at their own skin and even have providers do so. So we're working on a Wipe Out Melanoma California campaign that's really going to target individuals across all racial ethnic groups to increase skin cancer awareness and to promote early skin cancer detection as well as prevention. What about tanning? Well, I mentioned that UVB is the main ultraviolet rays that tend to cause the skin to tan, but a tan is actually your skin's way of protecting itself against further sunburn. It doesn't give your skin much of an SPF, and it means sun damage, and it doesn't prevent skin cancer, it doesn't prevent photoaging. So as much as we love to tan, or may love to tan for the cosmetic appearance of it, there is one safe way to do this, and that's by the use of artificial tanners. And if people remember back to the 70s, they had a QT tanning product that turned your skin relatively orange. And what this does essentially is stain the top layer of the skin called the stratum corneum. But it's safe to use because it doesn't change the way that our pigment cells produce melanin like true tanning does from ultraviolet light. It doesn't confer any protection though, so you do have to use sunscreen. So I just had to put this slide in. You're all orange, have been using that fake tanning spray. And the bottom line is sunless tanners are better than they used to be. I will always ask my patients when they come in and look like they have a tan, is this fake or real? And they'll say it's a fake tan. And I'll ask them what products they like. There's a lot of products over the counter that tend to be very cosmetically elegant, don't streak too much. People can go get a Mystic Tan or spray, but these are totally safe to do. Again, it's just staining the top layer of the skin. Vitamin D, I know this is kind of a busy slide, but you know, the tanning lobby has really pushed for vitamin D being beneficial using the tanning booths to get vitamin D. And that's really, again, not founded because most tanning booths emit UVA, and the bottom line is you tend to get your vitamin D from ultraviolet B light from the sun, along with diet and supplements. There is no question that vitamin D levels can be insufficient if you aggressively photoprotect your skin. And most people get enough vitamin D when they just walk to and from their car, they're doing their grocery shopping. They still can use sunscreen and such, but if you want to make sure your vitamin D levels are fine, it's perfectly safe to take supplements, 1,000 to 2,000 international units just of the vitamin D3, which is the active form. And that's a safe and recommended dose for most adults. So that's what we recommend for our patients because we want them to sun protect, not get more skin cancer, prevent new skin cancers, but also have those sufficient levels. And interestingly, the darker your skin is, the more time you need to spend in the sun to get the same level of vitamin D. So again, the advertising to people who tend to want to tan, who have lighter skin, to get into the tanning booth to do so is, again, just not founded. So I'm going to move on to sunscreens. And again, happy to move back in the end and start talking or answer any questions to move forward. But sunscreens and how effective they are and how safe they are really relevant for consumers. So sunscreens work by either absorbing UV light, and those are our chemical sunscreens, or reflecting, or more accurately deflecting those harmful UV rays. And those are our mineral or inorganic sunscreens. The sunscreens themselves, though, work better for UVB than they do for UVA, particularly in the United States. There are better UV filters that go all the way through that ultraviolet spectrum, including the far UVA range outside of the US than in, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But sunscreens are pretty good at preventing sunburn, and sunburn, as I said, is predominantly caused by UVB. When we talk about a sun protection factor, you're talking about UVB protection only. And this is the amount of time that you can spend in the sun without burning, without your skin reddening with the sunscreen versus not. The problem is people misunderstand that if you have an SPF of 15 and you spend 15 times more in the sun so before you burn, if your body is going to burn at a certain rate, putting on more sunscreen at that point where you start to get red doesn't help. So you really need to get out of the sun. In other countries, sunscreen's been capped at about an SPF of 50 because the absolute value of increasing sunscreens beyond 30 is questionable. But the problem we see for consumers is that most don't put on the accurate enough sunscreen to actually achieve what's in the marketed SPF. So people only tend to put on about a half to even a quarter of what you need. And I'll talk a little bit later about how much you need to put on. Now, current FDA labeling is that broad spectrum sunscreen, at least of an SPF of 15, reduces the risk of skin cancer and skin early aging if used as directed with other sun protected measures. So we tend not to just recommend sunscreen, but being cautious in the sun, trying to avoid the intense midday sun between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. if you can, using hats, protective eyewear, sunscreen, and protective clothing, all these things. So enjoy the outdoors, but be careful. Broad spectrum sunscreens, over time, it's been very clear that they need to protect against both UVB and UVA. In the US, we use a critical wavelength of what's called 370 nanometers. That's our critical wavelength to have broader spectrum UVA coverage, but it's not perfect because that UVA range actually goes up to 400 nanometers. And in the US, the best and essentially only sunscreens that tend to go up to that critical wavelength consistently are chemical sunscreens that contain avobenzone and octocrylene. So if you look for broad spectrum activity and you turn over on the label, you'll see these products which are very effective and they're good, but again, there are better products in other countries. Chemical sunscreens, as I said, absorb that UV radiation and then they inactivate it. I listed a bunch of the filters here, and PABA was an early filter for UVB. It's been taken off the market because it caused a lot of irritation of the skin and photosensitivity. The UVA filters, that the dibenzylmethane is that avobenzone. Triazenes are in other countries, and they are better. The mineral or physical sunscreens are reflecting that UV light, and they're very nice to use for people who might have an allergy to chemical sunscreens. Also probably safer to use in very young children under the age of 6 months, or actually when kids under 6 months, to kind of avoid a lot of the sun or direct sun using clothing and protection. But under the age of 2, they might be a good idea. The typical mineral sunscreen people think about is zinc oxide. This was obviously that super opaque, Desitin diaper cream type formulation that no one's really going to use in terms of compliance. So over the last 20 years or more, there's been micronized forms of zinc oxide and titanium dioxide that are more cosmetically elegant and rub in. They are also deemed reef safe, and I'll talk a bit about coral reef safety in just a bit. But the problem with mineral sunscreens is you need to understand is they don't do such a good job even for UVB protection alone. And a lot of them have been enhanced by adding those organic or chemical filters to them to increase their SPF. And so when you're using mineral sunscreens, you want to try to use concentrations of at least 10%. And I usually recommend that patients go with at least 20%. And some of the clear zinc products by Neutrogena and others over the counter will have the SPF, or the concentration of the micronized zinc oxide of over 20%. So you really need at least 25% to get to that far UVA spectrum, and a lot of the mineral sunscreens don't have that. All sunscreens do allow some ultraviolet light to penetrate both UVA and UVB, so there's no such thing as a sunblock. Now, the FDA has done a great job with sunscreen monographs and really enhancing the understanding of consumers and looking at ingredients over time and really understanding and promoting broad spectrum sunscreen activity. I think what the FDA hasn't done such a good job on, though, is really taking a look at and approving ingredients that have been used, UV filters that have been used in other countries worldwide for decades and used safely, and that are actually better than our US ingredients. In 2002, sunscreen manufacturers from Europe and other countries had actually filed for the FDA to approve 8 new UV filters or sunscreen molecules. And I've got 2 of them highlighted because I'll talk about them later. This was supposed to have been done in 180 days based on the worldwide safety and efficacy data for at least a period of 5 years prior. Nothing has happened, though, unfortunately, over the last 18 years, even following the passage of the Sunscreen Innovation Act in 2014, which directed the companies to make a decision on these long pending applications in March of 2015. And in fact, what happened in March of 2015 was the FDA rejected all of these filters that were under this time and extent application review, asking the manufacturers to provide more studies. And they even took one ingredient that had been in our US market. It was a specific ingredient called Campsil or Mexeril in the Anthelios sunscreens in the US. They took it off the market and nothing's happened. So we have had very little innovation in sunscreen technology in the US for a long time, unfortunately. Sunscreen safety has been brought up by the Environmental Working Group and other individuals, and the EWG is actually a sort of consumer-based watchdog group that's looking at laboratory studies where animals are typically subjected to medications or topical agents that are used in thousands times greater exposure than human use. So some of these are studies that would involve injection or ingestion of an agent. There were several concerns that had been raised related to some of the products on oxybenzone, retinol palmitate, which is a vitamin A derivative, parabens, which are preservatives, and the titanium dioxide nanoparticles. And all of these concerns have actually been refuted, and the FDA does not question the safety of any of the ingredients in marketed sunscreens, recognizing how the benefits outweigh the risks. But there are some newer concerns I wanted to mention, and this has to do with absorption. And 2 studies came out in the last year where individuals were, again, in a very experimental, non-real life setting, using sunscreen to their body, 75% of the body, 4 times a day for 4 days. And then the investigators measured the levels of 4 of the typical US chemicals and found that there was a higher concentration than the FDA threshold to waive what's called non-clinical toxicology studies. This was not deemed unsafe to humans. Even the FDA weighed in and said there's no recommendations against sunscreen use, but further investigations warranted. So unfortunately, I think these kind of data are taken by consumers and somehow advertised to say that sunscreens are unsafe. And really no one I know, not even my red hair patients with melanoma, are going to use sunscreen to their body, 75% of it, 4 times a day. So again, this is just not a practical setting. The other issue that's come about for, that consumers are becoming wary about sunscreens relates to coral reefs. And we do have, again, experimental settings where the sunscreen is essentially applied to the reef, and it can maybe contribute to hard coral bleaching. But when you talk to representatives from the EPA and individuals around the world, there are lots of other causes that we see for coral reef damage, including increased ocean warming, increased ocean acidity, pollution, jellyfish, and even seaweed blight. So there are many other causes that are contributing to damage to coral reefs. But there have been some studies suggesting that the oxybenzone, which is a common UVB filter, as well as octinoxate, which used to be put into those mineral sunscreens to make them better, may be culprits. And so a lot of sunscreens you'll see now will be called reef safes. Those chemicals are likely to come out, which is fine. There are better chemicals out there. And then the Environmental Protection Agency deems mineral sunscreens more reef friendly. So just so you know, it doesn't mean people shouldn't use sunscreens. And in reality, when you're snorkeling and scuba diving, most people should be using, protective clothing anyway to protect themselves and the coral from damage. So there's little to no sunscreen controversy now. We know these sunscreens that are broad spectrum are safe and effective against protecting against sunburn. They prevent the common type of skin cancer called squamous cell skin cancer, as well as those pre-cancers called actinic keratoses. A large Australian randomized study published in about 2010 showed a 50% melanoma decreased risk if you use sunscreens regularly. We know they prevent photoaging as well. And that's a main way we advertise to younger individuals and teenage girls who are more apt to seek tanning and tanning bed use. Really can help minimize photoaging over time. We do, as I said before, usually not just recommend sunscreen, but kind of a whole photoprotective package that's going to include photoprotective clothing, polarized sunglasses to protect the eyes, broad brim hats, umbrella shade structures, sun avoidance when possible. We want people to be out and healthy in the sun, but be safe. The clothing itself, fortunately, it has an ultraviolet protection factor, UPF 50, has now become more accessible. You can buy this now at REI and most sporting goods stores. It used to be a little harder to get. You had to order from certain companies, and these tend to do a very good job if people don't want to use sunscreen. Okay, and don't forget to protect your lips. You don't have to use brightly colored zinc oxide products here, but just a reminder that we do see skin cancers, particularly the squamous cell type on the lip. And so you want to use lip balms that contain sunscreens. And I tend to want to have my patients look for those ones that have the better chemicals. In the US, that would be the avobenzone with the octocrylene to provide that better UVA filtration. No sunscreens are waterproof. The FDA has abandoned the term. You'll see water resistant. And what this means is that the sunscreen, actually it's UVB quality, so the SPF is maintained after either 40 or 80 minutes in water. This is a problem we see for people doing a lot of water sports and people who obviously participate in as athletes, swimming, water polo, crew, etc. You want to try to think about using some of the more greasy sunscreen sticks that stay on a little bit better, or sport formulations, but we still haven't come up with a perfect water resistant sunscreen. So when we talk about sunscreens and how to use it, remember to put enough on. Again, most people put on about 1/4 to 1/2 of what they need, and you want to try to put a shot glass full is kind of an easy way to remember it. That's an ounce. Putting on about 2 to 3 tablespoons to the body, and then a teaspoon to your face. It's a lot of sunscreen, and if you're using it that often, you'll go through it. You don't have to apply it and let it soak in before it's effective. It's not necessary to do that, but if you wanted to just put it on dry skin, it tends to be better than putting it on wet skin. You do want to reapply it every 2 hours or so after heavy sweating or swimming. And it's important to understand too that the sunscreen materials or the ingredients tend to degrade in the heat. We all tend to leave it in our car in the glove compartment, but do try to not get it to overheat. And also toss it out about every 2 years, check the expiration date, but replace your sunscreen not infrequently, just so that it maintains its efficacy. The Tinasorb sunscreen, I just want to mention, this is a trade name for 2 superior UV filters. There's actually 3 out there now. It's not a sunscreen name, and it gets confusing, but remember the word Tinasorb, and when you look for it, put it into your Google search bar, look at it on Amazon, and I put another pharmacy mix from, another website from Canada that you can find it at. This is not available in the United States, and it's a superior filter with really known no safety concerns at all. And there are chemical names: bezotrozole, bemetrizonol, Tinasorb M, Tinasorb S. There's another one. And I put in the red, you can see here, triazine, triazole. These are the newer for the US, UVA sunscreens that really work to go across that entire UV spectrum. And I really do recommend these for individuals. It is legal to purchase them outside of the US. They're over-the-counter products, like ordering a perfume or a lotion or a soap. So yeah, it is perfectly fine to find these. And again, whenever you look for them, make sure you put the word Tinasorb in. There is no product in the US that has these in them right now, unfortunately. And just so you can see here, I don't know if I can move my screen to show you a little bit here, but this is, again, a long chemical name. This is from Sunscreen from Canada. You can buy these, again, you can see these in the airport in other countries, pick them up and buy them, bring them back, but this is just a long chemical name. And some of these also contain Mexeril or Campsil, which is also better than what's in the US sunscreens. Just my last slide, I think, on sunscreen before we move on to poison oak. Just to mention that price has nothing to do with performance. You don't have to spend a lot on sunscreens. The cheapest ones typically outscore the most expensive products on Consumer Reports testing. And this test that they did in 2016 looked at 65 sunscreen lotions, and 43% of them failed to meet the SPF claim on their labels. Again, most of those were the mineral sunscreens. So the mineral sunscreens, again, unless they're boosted or a high enough percentage of that zinc or titanium dioxide, don't tend to do as well. But you don't have to spend a lot. And I usually tell people to just get a brand that they like. If teenagers break out, get a non-acne causing one. Use a different face one if you want. A lot of people like the sport ones that don't run into the eyes and such. Okay, I'm going to move on to poison oak and talk a little bit about how to treat it, how to avoid it. And everyone, I think, probably listening has experienced poison oak, poison ivy, and hopefully not poison sumac. It is the most common cause of allergic contact dermatitis in the United States, and we'll see at least 10 to 50 million cases annually, with poison oak being the most relevant in the western states, poison ivy in the eastern states, and poison sumac, which looks more like a fern, is less common, but in the southeast US. It is a really significant occupational hazard for forestry workers and for firefighters who actually can get a lot of respiratory inhalation of the allergen here, and that can be a big problem. And then, of course, for recreational wilderness users. The plant itself is Toxicodendron. It used to be called roost dermatitis, and if everyone's been at Roost Ridge in the Los Altos area, that's because there's so much poison oak, and we see this all the time. It's everywhere on our trails. The allergen itself, with the thing that causes the contact dermatitis, is actually a very greasy substance called an oleo resin, and that's urushiol. It typically only affects man, and so it won't really affect your dog or your cat, but those animals can act as a reservoir to give you poison oak dermatitis. It is seen in all 50 states except for Hawaii and Alaska. We'll see it from sea level to at least 5,000 feet elevation. I've definitely seen it at some higher elevations, but tends not to be in super high elevation. And then the moniker that we think about is, leaves of 3, let them be, with poison ivy having 3 leaflets, poison oak 3 to 5, and sumac, again, looking more like a fern. Most of the US adult population is sensitive. About 10 to 15% don't tend to get it even with exposure, and they're very lucky. So this is just a picture of poison oak. I think everyone's seen it. It turns a lovely color in the fall. Unfortunately, when the leaves fall off, the entire plant has that oleo resin, the urushiol, in it. And so even brushing against the twigs of the plant in the winter months will give you the dermatitis. It does itself, the urushiol has cross-reactivity to other plants in this specific family of plants, and it's relevant to understand if you're severely allergic to poison oak, you could have a reaction to the skin of mangoes. I've even seen someone with a reaction to dried mangoes, so that's less common. Cashews as well. So there are cross-reactivities you have to be aware of, and we'll see those as a perioral dermatitis, a rash around the mouth. And the oil, again, is found throughout the branches and stems of the plant. It dries very quickly. And so it's non-volatile, but it becomes in its dry state an indefinite antigen, meaning it will retain that ability to cause the rash forever. So you really do have to wash it off of garden utensils, wash your pet if they've been exposed, and so on. And you only need less than a pinhead to cause a reaction. So it doesn't take much, especially when you are exposed. Now, the poison oak urushiol antigen actually will oxidize when it's exposed to air, and it forms this black dot. And we've actually seen cases where the exposure on the skin is so severe that people get black dots in the skin. So that's just something you can look at on the plant. You can touch the plant to get the contact. Again, indirect touching, something that had contact with the resin, sports equipment, animals, etc. And then, as I said before, it can be aerosolized in smoke, and that can cause a lot of problems in firefighters. The resin itself is easily degraded in water, but it's got to be removed quickly. And so most of the time, water alone is okay, soap and water, rubbing alcohol. And now that everybody is using hand sanitizers and carrying these around, use a hand sanitizer to get it off, but get it off your skin quickly, because the resin binds to and penetrates the epidermis, and that's the top layer of the skin, on contact. So you want to wash it off if you can within 30 minutes of exposure. And some studies have been done showing that even after 10 minutes, you can only remove 50% of the urushiol from the skin, meaning that most of it will have sort of bound to the skin and do its action in terms of causing a contact rash. And after an hour, almost none can be removed. And that really is important, because a lot of these post-exposure products are telling you they can continue to remove poison oak resin from the skin days later. So that's just not true. Again, and you want to wash affected objects in pets that are exposed. Post-exposure treatment products, there's a bunch of these over the counter. Very questionable whether they're any better than just plain water or soap or water. And in one study of Zanfil, which is a mix of soap, mix of fatty acid and a surfactant, that was compared to a typical brand of bar soap, and then also goop. And again, no major benefit. The studies that are out there are very small. And they haven't been, again, compared to common things. You're welcome to use wipes or whatever you want to carry with you. But again, just get that resin off your skin. But there's no magic post-exposure treatment product. The eruption typically occurs within 2 days of exposure of the plant and then the resin getting on the skin. You may see delayed outbreak in areas of thicker skin. So the face, anything in the groin, if people are touching that area, or the backside, if you're doing your business in the woods, anything around the eyes, you're going to see a more rapid eruption because the skin is so much thinner than, say, on the back. And so the blister fluid, when the blisters form, is not contagious. It doesn't spread from one side to the other, but we do often see sort of this sequential or progressive evolvement of the poison oak, depending on how much of the resin was in one side of the body to another. And of course, you can smear it on different sites. Most people most reactions will kind of be occur in about 1 to 14 days after contact. And again, this will go away on its own. It does take a few weeks to go away, though. It causes this intensely itchy linear eruption, often with blisters that we see. And that's kind of what we think of for an outside job. So nothing in your body causes a reaction. This is kind of something hitting your skin in a really classic plant dermatitis. And so that's typical reactions I think most of us have seen. And then I have a busy slide on how to treat it, just so people are aware. So in dermatology, we want to go after these very itchy plant dermatitis conditions with topical steroids. We tend to need to use ones that are much stronger than the ones that are over the counter. And the only thing you can get over the counter is hydrocortisone. So I put down some of the names of some of the strong ones. And then in the face or the folds, we'll tend to use a lighter or lower potency steroid just for safety. But we have a very low threshold to use oral steroids called prednisone or other things when the rash is more severe, or again, when it does involve anything in the groin area, the perianal area, or on the face. And the regimen, though, has to be about a 2-week regimen. We see patients who go to an urgent care clinic and may get a 5-day regimen of prednisone, and then they tend to have a breakout of the poison oak again by day 3. So it has to be tapered slowly. Anything that dries up the blisters tends to help. So Dombro soaps can dry up the blisters, and that reduces itching. Cool compresses can reduce itching as well. Oral antihistamines can help for itch. And then there are over-the-counter anti-itch lotions and agents that I've listed: calamine, Gold Bond. Those contain an anti-itch agent called pramoxine, and then menthol and camphor lotions. There are products, though, that you want to avoid, and those would be topical anesthetics, topical antihistamines. They don't work. Jewelweed, which is a Native American remedy, has no effect in testing. And then, as I said, people have talked about using shaving cream. People have talked about using Neutrogena oil-free acne wash, which contains 2% salicylic acid. It's probably working or alleviating some of the symptoms just by drying up the blisters. Prevention, barrier creams. Again, your best barrier is going to be wearing clothing. Although the poison oak resin can go through very lightweight t-shirts that are wet because it kind of wicks right through. But most of the time you're going to want to wear dry clothing that can help prevent the resin from getting through. There were some products tested a long time ago that tend to reduce skin reaction as barriers themselves. And then one that came out 2006, Ivy Block, and that was a bentonite clay that actually showed very good efficacy in preventing poison oak, but it appears to be off the market. I can't find it anywhere. Plant abatement, avoid anything that's going to spray your legs with urushiol, so that would include lawn mowers, weed eaters, and you can use any kind of weed killers instead. And then again, just remember, fabric is a very good protective measure. Plant dermatitis that we also see, we have to think about, often occupational and gardeners and florists, but we do see some in the wild, and I've listed some of the ones we see here with the century plant, daffodils, peppers, radishes, cow parsnip, and jewelweed, and then the giant hogweed, which actually causes a very severe sun-related rash and can cause blisters, and then stinging nettles, which we tend to see by river, stream, or creek beds, which cause painful hives. And then I just want to put, this is my last plant dermatitis slide before we briefly go over insect repellent, but this is something that people should recognize and be aware of, and this is actually Lyme disease, not to be confused with the tick-borne Lyme disease, but this is a chemical reaction that we see to lemons, limes, celery, carrots, parsnips, and that hogweed plant, and it's because there's a photosensitive material in them, so a lot of heavy use of squeezing limes in drinks at the beach or such, and if you get it on your skin, you can actually get this darkening and you can get blisters, and it's very uncomfortable. So try to be careful when you're squeezing limes and lemons, particularly outside in the sun. Bug bites, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on just in terms of how to avoid them. And everyone knows what causes them: fleas, mosquitoes, bees, wasps, bed bugs, bites, and ticks. Very itchy. We call this papular urticaria in dermatology. Mosquitoes are a typical or very important vector for illness, including malaria, yellow fever, dengue fever, chikungunya, West Nile virus, and Zika virus. And typically, again, bite in the areas of skin that are exposed, tend to bite at dawn or dusk. And so risk factors for mosquitoes, interestingly, tend to be male sex, blood type O, and increased BMI, which I think is interesting. You can treat these with topical steroids using a single dose of, sorry, I've got one notification here. Let me get rid of that. You can use a single dose of Zyrtec or cetirizine to reduce the pruritus and itch. And then again, abatement in standing sources of water is important. Ticks, key tick-borne illnesses in the US, I've listed Lyme disease and Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and that's a picture of the deer tick on the right when it's engorged versus not. So it's a very tiny tick when it's not engorged with blood. And these can cause severe reactions, may even need antibiotics to treat, say, Rocky Mountain spotted fever and Lyme disease, as most people know. We still don't have a good vaccine for that. Treatment and prevention, I'm going to focus on the prevention. And so insect repellents work because they tend to block the insect's sense of smell. And insects need their olfactory senses to land on your skin effectively and bite. And so if we can block that, jam their sense of smell, we can prevent that. And DEET, picaridin, lemon eucalyptus, all these ones that I've listed here are the ones I'll go over briefly. Pesticides are different. Pesticides kill the insect on contact. And so you don't want to put these on your skin, not that they're not safe to, but because if you put it on your skin and wait for it to kill the insect, they've already bitten you. So these tend to go on clothes. DEET has been around since the 1950s. Again, many brands of it. It's gotten a bad rap in terms of potential safety, but most of that's from misuse of it. It's effective against a lot of insects, not so much for wasps and bees. And again, it creates that offensive barrier vapor that blocks the insect's sense of smell. Higher concentrations last longer, but it plateaus at 50% DEET. So 10 to 35% concentration tends to be adequate. We don't want to use over 30% in kids. And for ticks, you need at least 20%. You can use this in infants over 2 months of age as well, again, but not going over 30%. We don't like combination products of DEET and sunscreen because you need to keep reapplying sunscreen. You don't want to keep reapplying the DEET, and it also may increase its absorption. You don't need to apply it under clothes. You don't need a heavy application, so you can use sprays and wipes in kids, and don't ever though spray a face. Obviously, you'd want to spray it on your hand and then wipe it on the face. The toxicity from DEET is rare. There's been 43 case reports over 5 decades, and most of these, again, were from improper use of the agent, including ingestion. It is safe on fabrics, but it can damage spandex and leggings. And so if you're thinking about, hiking in your biking clothes or your leggings, it can damage those. It also can damage plastic in watch faces and in eyeglass frames. So be careful with that. And if you don't want to use DEET, you can use picaridin. Picaridin was really used more commonly in Europe and now is FDA approved or EPA, I should say. Insect repellents are regulated by the EPA, not the FDA. But it's been in the US really for some time now. And it's a great alternative to DEET, and it works just as well. It was, again, approved in the US in 2005. It is less irritating than DEET. It's not sticky or greasy, has the same vapor barrier effect. And it is the WHO, the World Health Organization, compound of choice for mosquito repellent for malaria prevention. And that's because the typical mosquito that causes malaria often is resistant to DEET. There's no toxic events that have been noted except for skin or eye irritation, again, from misuse. And you can also use this in kids in a 5 to 10% concentration, but typically over 2 years of age. IR 3535 is another option in Avon Skin So Soft Bug Guard and others. You have to use over 10% to repel mosquitoes for several hours. It's not as common as DEET or picaridin. Botanicals, oil of lemon eucalyptus ole, it's OLE. These use essential plant oils as insect repellents, and they can be safer and also more ecologically acceptable than some of the other insect repellents. They often are greasy though, so that can actually dissuade consumers from their use. They don't tend to work as well for ticks, particularly the OLE. And then this particular lemon eucalyptus is not recommended in kids less than 3 years of age. And some of the brands here, but these work perfectly fine. Citronella, though, is another botanical that is commonly used. People use it in candles and spray it outside and such, but the problem is it doesn't protect against ticks. It's very volatile, and so it's less effective. It tends to last only 20 to 30 minutes. And so it's one that we would steer away from compared to the other better lemon eucalyptus or the other insect repellents. And then there are other essential oils that have been looked at between clove, geraniol, and patchouli, which tend to be irritating to the skin and not as effective. Neem is another vegetable oil from the fruits and seeds of the plant called neem. This is a known reproductive toxin. It also has a high level of contact dermatitis, so don't use it. Garlic, vitamin B, kind of the same thing. These certainly are not harmful, but I love these studies where people actually put their arm in a box and have 10 mosquitoes in there to bite them. They've done a study which was placebo-controlled, meaning there was no treatment versus essentially using garlic or vitamin B on this and taking vitamin B, and there was no difference. So these natural repellents don't really work as well as the known insect repellents. Now, permethrin, you want to use this again on your clothes because the insect is going to bite your skin if you put it on your skin and wait for it to work. And this is very effective for ticks, mites, and mosquitoes. In fact, we use permethrin to treat scabies, which is a very itchy skin eruption from a skin mite. You want to pre-treat the clothes. You can use a 0.5% concentration, which will last 6 weeks or 6 washes. There's also pre-treated clothing that you can buy, Buzz Off Insect Shield, which is good up to 70 washes. You don't have to buy the pre-treated clothing, but you can spray sleeping bags, tents, netting. So if you look at the EPA, they think the best insect repelling system would be permethrin on your clothing or camping gear, and then DEET or picaridin on the skin. Sonic repellers, ultrasonic devices, incense, unfortunately, they don't work. Backyard sprays last a short amount of time. They don't kill the mosquitoes, so they come right back after you use them. And then mosquito coils, I just want to mention, we wish these were better than they are, but they're actually made of a powdered insecticide, and they smolder over 8 to 10 hours. And studies have shown they release the same amount of particulate matter as burning up to 137 cigarettes and formaldehyde as much as 50 cigarettes. So I would not use mosquito coils if I had an option. The biggest barriers to use are safety concerns for insect repellents, and that's a big problem because we want to prevent vector-borne illnesses, particularly all the tick and mosquito bite diseases we see. Pregnancy, there are certain ones that are listed as safe during pregnancy and breastfeeding, including DEET, picaridin, the lemon eucalyptus oil, and the IR 3535. Permethrin is also safe to use in pregnant women, again, on your clothing. And you can use these with sunscreens, but you want to apply the insect repellent after the sunscreen. not before. And then you may need to reapply sunscreen over it. And again, avoid those combination products. So new labeling came about around 2016 from the EPA, showing how to look at how long you're going to get protection against mosquitoes and ticks, and also what the agents are. So this is very helpful to look at now on insect repellents, how long you'll get protection and in what type. And that's all I have. And I wanted to just sort of rush at the end, so we have a little time for questions. Thank you, and stay safe outdoors. So Marty, I will turn it again over to you. I know I went a little fast, but wanted to get through everything.
That's great. And thank you so much, Susan. That is just a huge kind of around the world in 60 minutes on
40, right?
Yeah, and how to be safe out there. You've answered a number of questions that came in through the chat, but I did want to just reiterate for people that this broadcast will be up on our Facebook channel, and you'll be able to access it and share it with your friends there. But we did have a couple of questions. So I wanted to ask you, maybe going back to the sunscreen questions first. So one person asked, like, when I reapply sunscreen the second or third time, it seems like the sunscreen wants to sit on top of my skin and stays sort of white. Is it doing its job when it's white like that, or what would you recommend there?
So those are going to be the sunscreens that contain the mineral or physical sun agents, so the titanium dioxide and zinc oxide. A lot of them are just very chalky and pasty and hard to rub in. And so the more you'll put on, you'll just get kind of a buildup, because again, they're not absorbed. Those stay on the skin. And that's why, just sort of cosmetically, and also because I've been impressed that some of the clear zinc formulations, they rub in a lot better. I mean, they don't really have that opaque texture or look to them. And then they have a higher percentage. So more than anything, just be sure your mineral sunscreen has at least 10% of the ingredient, whether it's the zinc or the titanium dioxide. But they can they're a barrier, so they're not going to rub in. I believe it will look more white and sticky. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So then also, are there any supplements or oral medications that are known to help with sun damage?
It's a great question. I had a slide on it and took it out because of time. So there are things coming down the pipeline. There's a drug called alpha melanotide, which actually is a pigment stimulating drug. Unfortunately, right now, it's actually a nutritional supplement that is not deemed safe, but it has been studied in people with severe photosensitive disorders, and it and other things might be useful to enhance your own pigment production without harmful UV light, but that's down the pipeline. In the meantime, there are things like polypodium, which is a fern extract. It's marketed as HelioCare. It has some evidence scientifically, again, to help people who have a severe type of what's called porphyria, where they react to the sun with very sensitive eruptions and blisters, and is now being FDA approved for that, but it's in higher doses. And you can find this, it'll be called, I think it's not Fern Block, but HelioCare. But it might be useful, and more studies are being done on wash-on soaps and sunscreens, vitamin C and antioxidants, but no evidence yet that taking certain antioxidants can help your skin, though this is an active area of research. It's a great question.
So a couple more. So moving into more of the poison oak and the bug area. So is it true that you become more sensitive to poison oak the more frequently you've had it?
That tends to be the case. So I know my husband gets it. He just looks at it, the plant, and he gets it. Yeah, he's outside all the time. So the more you tend to be more sensitive. That's true.
And you mentioned,
right, I should say people who have eczema tend to be less sensitive, probably because they have a different immune makeup of the skin. Sorry, go ahead.
Interesting. And then you mentioned, the hand sanitizer. So does rubbing alcohol also work to get rid of the oil?
Absolutely, yeah. Any kind of, so if you've got your water bottle and you think you've brushed into the poison oak, and a lot of us, again, are being very considerate on the trails now, moving off to the side, just, with COVID, but use your water bottle, squirt it off. If you've got hand sanitizer, put it on your legs or wherever it's come into contact. So absolutely, looks great.
A couple other quick questions coming in here. Do you know if statins increase your sensitivity to the sun?
There's a lot of, almost any drug can, but statins have been shown to potentially do that. They're not one of the more common sensitizers we see. So most of them tend to be, drugs that we use to treat hypertension, so high blood pressure, drugs to lower, drugs not so much lower cholesterol, but what was I going to say? So the antihypertensives and the diuretics, so the drugs you use for
yes,
but definitely, and certain antibiotics too. So like Bactrim or Septra, which is a sulfa drug, those can be sun sensitizing. But in dermatology, we say never because almost any drug can do anything. So,
and interesting question. So are people with the skin type 1 that are sensitive to the sun, are they also more sensitive to bug bites and things like that? Is that
not necessarily? No. It's just that their skin has such has a different type of melanin, a different type of pigment, and again, it just makes the skin so much more susceptible to the sun. So some studies have kind of estimated that the intrinsic SPF, meaning your body's own SPF with a skin type 1, is only about a 3, as opposed to a person with skin type 6, which is dark black skin, has an intrinsic SPF of 15. So that's just that it's not so much sensitivity though to bug bites or other conditions.
That's great. So while you were talking, I went and I got thing. I was looking at the
yes,
a very fine print here, and we've had a number of questions come through on products. You mentioned a lot of products today. Is there some place that we can send folks afterward to get, some listing of the names of all of the products that you talked about today? Is there a website or anything you can recommend?
So the bottom line is there isn't one that's going to have all these recommendations for the better sunscreens outside of the US. And again, those are the ones, if you're really going to be outside and obviously your hat's going to do a good job protecting, but I would use those on my face, the tops of my hands, the ears, and, in men who have thinning hair, you definitely want to use good sunscreens and sun protective clothing. Google the word Tinosorb, Tinosorb. You'll find it. It'll direct you to various websites on Amazon. And again, I listed one that we found to be very reliable, but it is a really good one to purchase. When you go to those websites, it will be in the Anthelios brand products and in another one called Avene, Avene. It'll be in those Umbrell products. So there's a limited amount of products you'll see it in, but any one of those is good. And it's been very consumer friendly to look at these because people know it's a good UV filter. So you'll see the word Mexeril or a Camsil is in a lot of sunscreens now, those same brands. The Anthelios brand in the US, again, does not have the better filters, either the Mexeril or the Tinosorb in it. So that's an unfortunate thing. As I said, the FDA actually took out Mexeril in 2015. So anything you use over the counter, it's limited. You can use anything you want. It's avobenzone and octocrylene are your main broad spectrum chemical filters going up to that 370 nanometer critical wavelength. And then you have the choice of the mineral ones, which are the zinc oxide and titanium dioxide. Doesn't matter what brand you use. So better to use any than none. And then use an SPF of 30 because people don't put on enough. So you don't need specific recommendations, and you sure don't have to spend a lot of money at a cosmetic counter getting something. I won't say the brands here, but you don't have to spend a lot of money on sunscreens. It is more expensive to get them abroad, though, and unless you're actually traveling abroad, but to order them abroad.
So I think we have time for one last question. Lots of questions around clothing. Is the clothing really effective? I mean, you did the test that said, most of the sunscreens weren't really up to what they advertised. Is SPF 50, is a sun shirt that says it's SPF 50, is that really what it is?
Yeah, they can't use an SPF, so it's a UPF. So the UPF 50 is fine. So I have plenty of patients who don't want to use sunscreens. I'm like, use protective clothing. Some of them will wear gloves, but I'll say you can definitely at least put it on the tops of your hand, but protective clothing is fine. Look for the UPF 50. And I see Katie posted a question about picaridin, which is the insect repellent, and whether it damages spandex. It does not. So it doesn't damage the plastic spandex rayon that we see with DEET. So picaridin is a really nice alternative, and it's in the Cutter. I think it's in, you can find, just look on the back of insect repellents and you'll see what's in them, but it's a really good option.
That's great. I think that this was really time well spent. I'm going to go now claw through all of my various medicine cabinets and places where I stow sunscreen and look at dates. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Swetter, my friend Susan, and for all of you that joined us and participated in in the session. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Marty. It was a lot of fun.
Go have fun in the sun.
But be safe.